So hello everybody, welcome to this breakout session where we're going to take a close-up look at the evolving landscape of food safety risks in the world that are changing very fast. So climate change is obviously playing an important role here in driving emerging risks and making the food safety detective work even more complex. So we do have new technological tools, as we were just hearing from Donald's speech earlier and throughout GFSI, that are enhancing tracing capabilities that are helping eliminate risks faster and more effectively. So what we're going to do now is we have our panel of experts who I'm going to introduce to you in just a few moments. Each is going to make a presentation, and then depending on the time left, we'll have a quick Q&A. So I'm delighted to be joined by Marta Hugas, who's the independent food safety expert and former chief scientist at the European Food Safety Authority. Greg Dempsey, who is the chief executive of the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. Catherine Bessie, who is the Senior Food Safety Officer of Food Systems and the Food Safety Division at the FAO, and Donald Prater, who you all know because we just heard from him, who is the Principal Associate Commissioner for Human Foods at the US FDA. So, Marta, I'm going to invite you to the podium. I think you're going to say a few words now on the evolution of risk assessment methodologies.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm going to explain how is the EU system in collecting evidence for assessing and evaluating emerging risks at the EU level. And this task has been given to EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, by its founding regulation, 178 from 2002. And it asks EFSA to undertake several of actions. First, to identify and characterize emerging risks. And when we talk here about emerging risk, can be a risk posed by a new completely hazard, or a risk posed by increased exposure to a well-known hazard, or by increased susceptibility of certain kinds of the population to a known hazard. And also it establishes the monitoring procedures for systematically searching, collecting, collating, and analyzing information and data, and with a view to identify emerging risk in the fields within its mission. That means food, feed, animal health, environmental issues as well. But of course, the initial expectations versus reality, The initial expectations versus reality sometimes is different, because to be aware of what's as possible, what's happening in and outside of Europe is not easy. And also it's not easy to anticipate how food, feed, plant and animal health landscape could look like in the future. And also how to adapt and adjust eventually. When you identify a problem, then you need to reprioritize the work program in a given agency, so that also even maybe changing the strategy to be able to allocate resources to a possible emerging issue. To do so, we are not alone. We are based on this information provided by two very important networks. One, on your left side, is what we call the Emerging Risk Exchange Network, that is composed by representatives of all the EU member states, plus also the EE countries and Switzerland. But also we have representatives in this network of the FDA, of also FAO, WHO, Health Canada, and others. So we try to be as comprehensive as possible and engage with all national, within the EU, but also international partners in order to collect the best and most available information. But then also, because all these people that I mentioned are representative of regulators or governmental agencies or competent authorities, but we are also aware of the incredible wealth of information that the industry has. And for that, we have another network that's called a Stagiaire network, where all the professional associations are represented, so CLITRABI, COPA-COGECA, IDF, etc., so that there's a way to channel information and signals that industry identify in a way to also that they reach us. And how we do that, we meet several times per year, and when different actors bring to our attention a possible issue, then this issue is analyzed, And in 2023, you'll find also the report published in the EFSA website. There were 52 possible issues. Of those 52, 32 were potential emerging areas, issues, and they were classified according to the hazard. So there were 9 that were biological, 17 that were chemical, 2 that were biological and chemical, and 2 that were other, mostly identified as new processes or new technologies. So at the very end of all these 32 possible issues, 5 of them were classified as possible as emerging risk. And to say some more examples, one, for example, was about nanomaterials that were used in waste treatment plants, and this could also become a problem. Also, alcohol replacement drinks, pathogen spillover of a bat-associated virus by the environmental change. Also, rare earth elements coming from all the waste of electronic equipment that could also enter the landfill and the water cycle. Another one was an episodic hemorrhagic disease as emerging risk in the EU, transmitted by midges, by colloquialoides. So all these were the possible, as identified, emerging risk, and those were then transmitted to the EU risk managers. And also some of them, when there's enough available data, may be also subjected to a risk assessment, a full risk assessment, to see what could be the control options. But there were also some issues identified that were at the end classified not to be an emerging risk. For example, somebody brought the evidence or some data about the mycological risk of plant-based products, which are alternatives to animal products, and this was identified not to be an emerging issue. So this is the way the workflow works, and at the end it produces a briefing note, and this briefing note can then be subjected to further analysis or maybe also to collecting additional evidence. But I also would like to bring here a kind of a case study. It's a food supplement project, which is about collecting alerts to identify possible emerging risk from nutri-vigilance or monitoring systems in Europe and other accessible sources, such as toxic infections or signals from poison centers. And this is about performing an analysis on plant-based substances that are predicted to be toxic, and as outlined in the EFSA Compendium of Botanicals, and assessing their presence and implications in food supplements within the EU. Sorry. And the Compendium of Botanicals is an open source database for hazard identification of botanicals and botanical preparations. The database contains botanicals reported to be used in the EU as food, including food supplements obtained from extensive literature review, together with in vitro and in vivo toxicity data of substances of potential concern present in the plants. In addition to toxicity data, also QSAR prediction, as you know, a computational modeling method that predicts the biological properties of a substance based on their molecular structure, was also used to generate predictions, and the database is used by a tool by EFSA as well as food manufacturers, risk assessors, and risk managers in order to assess the safety of plant-derived products. So you see that from the slide that from 2,701 plant species, at the end we identified 7 possible positive and reliable QSAR results from the database that could result on really toxicity products. And those come from more than 1,500 substances of potential concern. So this is a way of anticipating and adapting on something that has been used sometimes maybe for years without really understanding exactly if there would be also a substance of potential concern. I'm stopping here and pass the floor to my next colleagues, and I'll be then happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I'm now going to hand over to Greg. You're the newly appointed Chief Executive of the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, and I think you're going to tell us a little bit about Ireland's perspective now on those emerging food safety challenges.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. As you just heard, I'm just appointed. This is my 5th week in the role, so hopefully I'll be as comfortable talking about this as I can be. This morning I'm going to cover our approach to emerging risks and also our intentions in respect of the use of AI in this area. I just don't think the slides are moving. Oh, I have to do it, sorry. So just before I start, I'll just give a quick overview of who we are and the food system we regulate. So our key remit is the enforcement of food legislation here in Ireland. But we also advocate for food safety, and we provide advice to government on food development issues and emerging risks. So we really are open and keen to collaborate and engage with all parties, national and international. In terms of the food system here in Ireland, I guess there's 3 things I'd flag. One is the continuing legacy from Brexit. The second would be that the Irish economy is very reliant on exports with a reputation for quality and safety to a large number of countries, and those exports are reliant on imports. So we are somewhat vulnerable to any shocks to the supply lines. And then the third thing I'd mention is there's a government initiative, Food Vision, which seeks to transform the agri-food business to a sustainability model. And we welcome that, but of course then we want to make sure that food safety issues are taken into account as that's progressed over the next years. When we consider food safety, emerging risks for the global food safety system, I guess the first thing you see is just how complex and interconnected the system is. And then if you add to that big risks that we see coming, geopolitical events, climate change, customer preferences, innovation, it does make it very difficult to try and model in isolation the impact of any one risk materializing. So our approach therefore, is to scan the system holistically and try and identify and detect as early as possible signals of emerging risks and deal with them. So we've developed in the FSAI an emerging risks identification and screening system. It's a data-driven system, and we collect information from a variety of sources in real time as much as possible. And then we use AI to supplement that, looking through literature and other sources of information, and then bring those together and try and then consider the risk and what we need to do about it. So I won't go through this slide in too much detail, but it just shows diagrammatically how the process works. So across the tops is the various sources of information, and that might be literature, engagement and information from other parties, national, international, people on the ground here, our inspectorate, AI, monitoring, social media, and so forth. And all those inputs then are brought together, and then either a briefing note or a situation report, if the risk is considered to be potentially more impactful, are considered by a standing group of experts in the FSAI. And they'll consider things about the veracity of the information, how reliable is it, what's the potential impact, is this the first time we've seen this risk, and so forth. And from that then, we'll determine a risk quantification, which then determines the next step. And that might be just to maintain a watch and brief, or it might be to do further risk assessments and determine what the mitigants are. And in all instances, we'll keep partners nationally and internationally in the loop. So what I'd say next is you can have these systems and processes, but they really only work where they're properly informed by engagement with other parties. So we value and place a huge emphasis on national and international collaboration. Now, it's a very busy slide, and it doesn't cover everybody that we engage with, and I won't go through everybody, but just briefly, domestically, we engage with scientists. We have about 67 expert scientists on our scientific committee. We use information from our laboratories and our inspectorate, and we have a close and confidential engagement with the larger manufacturers to get first-hand knowledge of what's happening on the ground. Then within Europe, obviously, we're very closely connected with EFSFA, but we also have a collaboration, just to mention it, with a group called Food Safer, which again is around helping us and others to share knowledge, but also work on our risk identification. And then more internationally, again, we're very involved with the international heads of food agencies, which are a great source of information sharing and lessons learning. So I'm going to move on to the second part of the talk here, starting our technology-enabled journey. But I should, as I was considering this last night, I should make very clear that we are using technology already to undertake a lot of our functions. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of where we're using digitization and AI to help with our regulatory functions. But we just recently published a new strategy for the FSAI, and within that there's two objectives. One is to become a data-driven organization, use the data we have to better analyze and predict emerging risks. And another action is to consider how better we can use AI, both for internal productivity and to undertake our statutory functions. We held our consultative council of the FSAI held an open day, a convention in February, and the topic was AI in food safety, innovation, risks and opportunities. And it provided a great opportunity for us to hear what people's plans are, what their expectations are, what they're currently doing, and how we might collaborate together to make sure that we're taking the greatest advantage of the opportunity AI presents. From that then, we're now considering how we might use AI for personal and organizational productivity. So for drafting the first set of guidelines, which we would then finalize with human intervention, as it were, perhaps using AI to make our advice lines more efficient. Then we're also considering how we might use AI to support our statutory functions, and you'll have heard from others on this already, but just data mining, surveillance across social media and so forth. We're also very aware that a lot of producers and manufacturers are starting to use AI in their food control systems. So we want to ensure that we understand the technology sufficiently so we can make judgments as to how much we can rely on that in undertaking our functions. I think what I'd say as a statement is we're keen to embrace the opportunity of AI, but we wanted to do it in a way that's ethical, complies with any relevant legislation, and most importantly, doesn't diminish the trust the public has in food safety in Ireland. Okay. Sorry. So I said I had three examples of where we're using it. So this first example, and I won't be going through this in detail, you'll be pleased to hear, but essentially, as we're considering emerging risks, there are a lot of papers being produced, and we just wouldn't have the resources to go through each of them. So we've developed this tool within the FSAI, which essentially runs through 5,600 in this example documents looking for keywords. It then filters that down to a smaller selection, which then is run through the process again, looking through the abstract for teams. And from there, then we filter again and ultimately end up with a manageable number of papers, which then one of our scientists can then read and input into our risk assessment system. The second example, we're using satellite technology to monitor for the growth of algae blooms, which can lead to toxicity in seafood. So we can, using this, identify where there's a risk of that as early as possible and inform relevant people, so that reduces the risk of that being entering the food chain. And then the final example is monitoring of social media. And here, across social media, there was one of these trends where people were purchasing a brand of chocolate called Dubai chocolate and making videos. But we were concerned that there was a risk of toxicity in the nuts used. And this allowed us then to identify that as a risk early and take the appropriate measures. So I'll finish there, but just to recap, we take a technology-driven, very proactive approach to emerging risk identification and then an agile response. We're very keen to use AI to embrace the opportunity of AI, and we're particularly keen because we see that collaboration will be the cornerstone of an efficient and effective approach to emerging risks in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. I'm going to hand over to you, Catherine. I think you're going to have a special focus now on, well, the FAO, obviously, and the impact of climate change.
Yes, and good morning to all. So yes, I'm going to present you in a few words the context of our work at FAO, our foresight program, the way it works, and give you a few snapshots of a few very recent reports. So for the ones of you who do not know really FAO, we are an agency of the United Nations. We were established in 1945. And so this year we are celebrating our 80th anniversaries. So the goal of FAO is globally to achieve food security, so feed the world. And that's really what drives all our actions. Feeding the world means that access to food should be regular and be of a high quality, so that people can live active and healthy lives. And of course, that entails food safety. Another characteristic of FAO that I'd like to mention is that, yes, you have a picture of our headquarters because that was the easiest to place on the picture, but we have offices all over the world, and more specifically, we have representations in 130 countries. On top of that, we have bodies, international bodies, such as the Codex Alimentarius Commission, that you certainly know, where we have 190 member nations who are gathering and discussing food safety issues. So it gives us a good, how would I say, feel of the temperature all around the globe, and not just from a climate change perspective. So, as I was mentioning before, food safety is really central to the mandate of FAO, because, of course, food safety, first and foremost, supports public health. It's absolutely essential to sustain a healthy life, and that's clearly already in our top mandate. But we are also an agricultural agency, and as we all know, the trade aspect of agricultural commodities is also very, very important. So we do take that also strongly into account in our mandate, because we do consider that trade is absolutely critical to alleviate poverty. It's also a very strong element of, livelihoods and food security, because it allows households to earn their livings. And you need to eat safe, for sure, but you need to be able to afford your food. So that's another critical element. So altogether, we have that food security mandate that really drive our actions. And that actually is, let's say, the wider perspective of our strategic priorities for food safety. So that is 2 years ago, in a parallel effort with our colleagues from WHO, we revised our strategies so that they are aligned and mutually supportive, so that we can really give coherent and consistent advice to our members to act for food safety. So in FAO, we have 4 strategic outcomes to drive our actions in terms of food safety. The first one deals with intergovernmental and multi-stakeholder engagement in intersectoral collaboration and coordination, and food safety governance. So a lot of words to mean activities like One Health, and most importantly that talks to you is Codex Alimentarius Commission. All those activities that bring together on board different stakeholders to decide on food safety governance. The second outcome is actually one key pillar that we've been discussing very much those days, which is all the science that supports the decision-making, the governance of food safety. And so that's our scientific advice program, which performs risk assessments of microbiological, of chemical contaminants, of other specific issues such as allergens, etc. So all that advice goes and feeds into Codex work. The third strategic outcome is what I would call an essential pillar, but is probably less global in its vision. It's to support countries to set up strong national food control systems. Of course, by having strong national food control systems, countries will contribute more to the international governance under Codex, and will be also able to provide information and data that supports the scientific advice program. But to do that, you need to have the capacities at national level to understand what's happening, to collect data, to analyze that data, to make decisions on your food standards, export and exports, etc. So that's an essential pillar of our work. And I would, in one sentence, summarize it as countries need to implement Codex standards through those national food control systems and better participate in the shaping of Codex standards by having the relevant infrastructure at national level. The fourth outcome will also speak a lot to you because it's about the public and private stakeholder collaboration in making food safe. So this strategic pillar talks in particular to all those activities that we have to support the private sector, in particular, of course, in developing countries, and we do that as well in collaboration with partners of industrialized countries that can provide support and help us reaching out to the small and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries. And of course, we do also provide information, material, etc. to consumers so that we avoid misinformation or, all those issues that we've been discussing in previous sessions. So now, moving on to those considerations that shape the context of our work, we've been discussing also this week a lot about all those changes that have impacted on our work, climate change, the change in markets, the globalization of trade that has been going on for the last 30 years, significant increases, for example, in population size, which of course impacts on the amounts of food and water that will be required for humanity to continue to live, but also the growth in urbanization. And that, for example, and that's an important feature of our Foresight program, is to consider the impact of urban agriculture. Very important, I would believe. The novelty of foods, of technologies that we've been discussing also a lot, and the progress in science and research and development. So all this means that all those elements are interconnected and call for multidisciplinarity in addressing those issues. I think that's a significant feature of those changes that we are facing. We need also to take into account the changing consumers' preferences and the food consumption patterns. The changes in, let's say, the dietary preferences of consumers lead us to, let's say, what we call dietary risks. That is, let me take an example, allergens, food that consumers do not exactly identify with what they know they are, or ingredients that we are all very aware of that, or those magic foods, goji berries and whatever. So all these need to be factored into those changes that we need to take into account. In addition, it's just not new and a multitude of factors, but they are constantly changing. We have preferences, animal welfare, of course, and so plant-based diets, etc., etc. So it's really changing. And on top of that, the pattern to access information has changed as well. So food safety awareness has always been an issue, but it is also, as we saw this morning in our first session, it has changed as well in the manner people access information, understand information, etc. So a lot of changes, and this has driven us to actually put together that new program. So it dates back already 5 years ago, to build up our foresight program, which is actually conceived as a complementary element of our risk assessment program, which has been very well established. Actually, GFSI started to work in the 60s, so of course they've changed the way they assess risks, but it's been a long-established program. Foresight is much more recent. So, of course, with foresight, we are not pretending that we predict the future. We are also doing something that fills a different, let's say, place with regard to, capturing, those early warning activities. So it's filling that gap between this very cloudy future and changing. So as we are in Ireland, I guess we can look at the weather patterns here that are changing very fast. So it's filling that gap between a cloudy future and capturing those signals that really have to tell us, are we going into a food safety emergency? So it's filling that place, and it's the identification and monitoring of emerging food safety issues together with their drivers and trends. And that is really that is a very proactive activity. In FAO, I have to say we have this food safety foresight program, but we have a much bigger foresight program that captures different type of signals on, all the agriculture and environment sectors. And I think it's very handy and informative to be located within that much broader framework. So I've been a proud civil servant for the last 28 years in FAO. I love my job and I love the agency in which I'm working, because it really brings me to look at issues in a very open-minded manner, and being aware of the environment in which food safety is taking place. It has always been relevant, but I think it is even more relevant now. So we have a high level of multidisciplinarity in-house, and of course, a big number of stakeholders, not just food safety stakeholders, of course, but all my colleagues dealing with livestock production and aquaculture and fisheries, so in the production sectors, and my colleagues in forestries. So it's really a very diverse environment to work in. So coming now to our foresight process, let's say building on that very rich source of interactions with our different stakeholders, including, of course, the Codex membership. And that what makes us probably special is that, we can access the world. And that's really fantastic, because as we know, the complexity of supply chains, it's actually critical to have access to information from a diversity of source. And I would ask something else. We benefit from the trust of our members. So sharing information requires capacity to handle confidentiality and so on, but that is also very, very precious. And we, treasure that trust that our members have in us. So putting together the different sources, and of course there are very strong similarities with what is being done in Ireland or at EFSA and so on. And as you could see on the slides of my colleagues, we are all interconnected. So it's really looking at those issues with sometimes some different perspectives or being more data heavy in some areas. But putting that together and then having a series of filters and parameters to let's say priorities emerge. So you would have, of course, the possible impact, but I would say in our case also very important the possible scale, of those issues, taking into account our very broad membership. And then, of course, we run through analysis and produce reports. I will show you a few snapshots. And then, of course, go with communication. Something here.
You have to wrap quickly.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry. So I wanted to give you a few examples, and so you can find all those reports. We looked at food safety in a circular economy, looking at different trends that are happening at the moment. For example, integrated farming systems, which have been existing for ages, but given the magnitude of which they are used, then this can, let's say, increase some hazards and some risks that were associated with them. There's the climate change reports also that we discussed a little bit yesterday. So analyzing the different impact of rising temperatures and floods, etc., on the different points of the food chain. Another report that we issued recently is about environmental inhibitors for sustainable agriculture. What about the residues of all those matters, given that they are also regulated, but under very different types of regulations and generally not under food safety at the moment? So very interesting. It's all work ongoing, and of course, we continue to monitor the information that's coming out. So for the conclusions, I really would like to stress, if I have to make one, is yes, there are changes, many changes, going fast. The big challenge for us is to connect the policy-making, governance mechanisms, all those instruments that we have on the food safety, let's say, regulatory frameworks, together with the pace of technical change. And that is, let's say, our concern, and that's why we are having this program to make decision makers aware of what's coming up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And sorry to rush you through. There's so much knowledge in this room. It's absolutely fantastic. Donald, I'm going to invite you up now just for a few moments and maybe build on something you were speaking about below, which was, talking about this proactive approach that the FDA is taking.
Okay, now I'm ready. So these are some new data from CDC. We update these every several years, and so these are some of the most recent data on estimates of foodborne illness in the U.S. 9.9 million illnesses, 53,000 hospitalizations, 931 deaths. This is a reminder that all these are largely preventable. So the reason we're here today is to be able to do what we can do to look ahead for emerging risks, to look at the food production systems that we're familiar with, to avoid foodborne illness. One of our biggest tools that we have that we're still implementing is the Food Safety Modernization Act. We've been working 10 years to implement this. This is our framework for largely working to prevent foodborne illness. So we have preventive controls, we have produce safety, we have a variety of different mechanisms that we've taken into account. I mentioned traceability today as well. So risk-related activities, we're certainly working on risk communication, risk management, and risk assessment, also on rapid emergency response. One of the things that I would like to mention with respect to emerging risk, I mentioned some of the tools earlier today that we're using, artificial intelligence, machine learning, whole genome sequencing. But with respect to emerging risks, a couple of things to take a look at. New introductions into the food supply. Consumers are really interested. They have so many different products that are available. You all have so many different ingredients that are available to you now. We're seeing new things in the food supply. We've had some issues. So just a couple of years ago, we had a new type of protein flour that was introduced into the food supply. We were not able to definitively identify this as a cause, but the manufacturer did indicate that this substance that had previously been used for animal food, but now was being introduced into the food supply, was the source of some potential illnesses. And so we need to always be looking, as we're striving to present consumers with new opportunities to look at different protein sources or other different ingredients, but we need to be mindful that when we are introducing new items into the food supply, there could be some associated risks. Second area to look at, supply chains. So I think the point is not lost on anyone here today that supply chains are another vulnerability. And as supply chains change over time, it's an opportunity for things to be introduced into the food supply that we're not expecting. So economic adulteration is something that is still very much with us. Last year, we had a situation with contamination of cinnamon with lead chromate, and so it does happen. Lead is also a naturally occurring product, and so we're looking very much at heavy metals and things, but as we're looking at our ingredients and we're thinking about supply chains and where those are sourced from and the potential for not only natural sources of contamination, but also economically motivated adulteration, those are emerging risks that we'll need to be very mindful of as well. So I'll stop my remarks here. I don't think I have any other slides, but I'm anxious for the questions. So.
Thanks so much. Well, I think I'll start with you, Donald, straight away, while we've got what you said fresh in our minds. Because what I'm wondering is, how can regulatory frameworks remain flexible enough when we're seeing this kind of panoply of emerging risks that are ever evolving, this complexity that has been highlighted, in the context of industry, which requires some certainty? It's a question for you.
Yes, so regulatory frameworks, one of the things that I'm reminded of during the pandemic, we had to make adjustments in some of our regulatory frameworks to adapt to supply chains. A lot of food products are labeled for food service, and so that's not the same type of labeling that is necessary for consumers. But people have to eat, and so one of the things I think as regulators that we learn from the pandemic is that we do have to be able to assess risks and to be able to adapt our regulatory framework in the face of an emerging situation. And so we are looking, I think, at what some of those impacts are and how we can be able to adapt those. But regulatory frameworks are very important, and we sort of, that's the playbook that we all look at. But sometimes, in the case of emerging risk, when supply chains are rapidly and unexpectedly changing, it is important for regulators to be able to see what flexibilities we can put in that regulatory framework while assuring that food that goes to consumers remains safe. There may be some places that would be able to benefit our industry.
Thank you so much. So, Greg, I'm going to come to you now, and I know it's a bit unfair because you're new to the job, but if we're looking at this question of adaptability, of flexibility, what unique challenges, but also, I guess, opportunities too, would you identify in terms of Ireland to develop more resilient but also adaptive food safety systems in face of these global uncertainties that have been highlighted?
Yeah, well, again, yeah, I am relatively new, but with my background, and I was in health and the central bank regulatory side, a couple of observations that I've made already that kind of reflect what I've seen previously. You've got a regulator that's relatively small, but a sector that's far larger with a lot more resources. And they've the ability then to invest in innovation and so forth. So there is a little piece where the regulator might be running to keep up. But what I found very interesting here in this sector is the degree of engagement and collaboration between all the parties. So the government, the FSAI and the food sector itself, and a real willingness to share information, to share learnings and knowledge. And there's a couple of government initiatives, Food Vision, which is moving us, transforming us, the agri-food business to a sustainability model. But it's definitely on a partnership approach. Some elements are voluntary movement, but the government initiative provides the structure for those collaborations to take place. And I just see that as a very positive thing and will allow us as a regulator to be informed and therefore react to the change in innovations and emerging risks.
Yeah, so there is definitely that element of flexibility, but that's Ireland, I suppose, case in point, a very different economy, I suppose, if we were to compare that maybe to developing economies. And this is where I come to you, Catherine, because, you know, what would you see as some of the key barriers when it comes to kind of implementing new approaches to food safety in these developing economies?
Yes, but we started to discuss that a little bit yesterday. I think one key point that we made was there are incredible opportunities that are deriving from those new approaches, new technologies. The point is we don't want to see the divide that is already existing grow further by, you know, not having the developing countries able to adopt those approaches. There are different types of challenges, of course, but I think one very important is about information, capacity to collect data. So on the side of the authorities to be able to understand, you know, if that's really a concern in you know, their country. It's a little bit the chicken and egg issue. If you don't have data, why should that be an issue? And if it's not an issue, what should you collect data? So data collection, so I think those new approaches, machine learning, AI, and so on, are certainly going to be, you know, opportunities, but let's say, then you should have the infrastructure that allows you to use it. And that is still a big issue. So while looking at those new methodologies, instruments, we should not ignore those key, very traditional infrastructure gaps that are actually making the adoption of those technologies very difficult.
Yeah, it's a very mixed playing field, isn't it? But Marta, if we're just to look at the use of these new tools, AI, machine learning, could you help us define more clearly, I suppose, the role they will play in terms of food safety monitoring as well as risk assessment?
Well, I think they are, and they will be more and more key in risk assessment and also in food safety monitoring. And in that case, you know, in the EU, there's an Artificial Intelligence Act, which is a regulatory framework and also legal framework how to implement AI. And EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, has also a roadmap of how to step by step go and implementing AI and machine learning solutions, which is to be fully deployed by 2027. And those will be extremely useful in speeding up some of the risk assessment because, for example, in the evidence management, when there's a new food additive, a new sweetener, there are thousands of publications, thousands of scientific papers to be assessed. So this is helping already a lot, and there are already trials ongoing. Also in avoiding the risk of bias, of methodological issues in scientific publications. For example, also in the application of the new approach methodologies for toxicological assessment assessments. Also, the AI and machine learning will also be speeding up those solutions. And what about data analysis was already mentioned by Don also earlier. But we should not forget that with the application of these technologies, there are also challenges. And those challenges, we also have to keep them in mind clearly. For example, on ethics and trustworthiness, on data governance, and data quality. It cannot be that it's a black box and nothing, it's not transparent what's happening inside this black box, and then you get the answer. It needs also to be able to be followed and to be also to be explained and communicated. So that's also the challenges we need to keep in mind when applying those solutions. But I think that the world we will see in risk assessment and also on the food monitoring will be completely different in 5 years' time with all these technologies being already applied.
Well, that brings me to my final question to everybody, actually. If we're to project into the future, Catherine was talking about foresight, looking at long-term risks, but we can also look at more short-term risks. I would like you each to identify, I suppose, an emerging risk or a risk that you're really concerned about that could keep you up at night, that you're thinking, oh my God, how can we deal with this, with the level of, the pace of change that we're seeing today? But then, to leave us with a bit more of an upbeat note, the opportunities that you're identifying. And I imagine that will probably be technological. We've already identified machine learning, AI, data science, but just hone it in maybe into that risk. I don't know who wants to start with you. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot with that question. I think I'll begin with you, Catherine, because you were talking about the FAO and this whole foresight strategy, which is really quite fascinating.
So I don't think I will answer your question straightforward, but I think I'm more concerned with those changes. How can we, so for example, what I was mentioning about population growth, urbanization rates, so it's changing completely the life of the populations in the developing world in particular. So urban agriculture, for example, that is something that really concerns me in terms of how will that impact. It's key to the supply chains of millions of people living in towns or cities that are growing and growing in the developing world. So you'd like one that's one I would really think about. But let's keep the question in a little bit broader manner. How is the sustainability of our food systems going to affect the supply? And I really think it requires us to probably do a shift rather than focusing on one risk, but changing the approaches we have to risks to embrace those changes. So that's what keeps me awake at night.
Keeps you awake at night. But and the opportunity would be, if I understood correctly, a systems change in terms of perceiving risk, to be able to identify them and start acting now, applying the technologies we have at hand already.
Embracing multidisciplinarity, working beyond silos, which is easy said, very difficult to do, because we all stick to our disciplines. So that's...
Okay, and Donald, if I were to call it a black swan event, I don't know if that's something that, terminology you might use in your ranks at the FDA, but are there any kind of these black swan events that you're being asked to kind of identify the unknown unknowns in some respects, but what is there to help you kind of perceive that, try and identify it, and then act upon it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Supply chain risks. I think understanding supply chains, especially where supply chains have become consolidated. As some of you will know, we had an experience with infant formula in the US not that long ago. And it became acutely apparent to everyone that supply chains were very consolidated, so that if you have an issue with just a single manufacturer, you can really impact dramatically product availability. So I think understanding risks in the supply chains is very pertinent right now. If you look upstream, to your suppliers, is there opportunities for those things for the supply chain to have become very consolidated? Maybe even over the time that you've been purchasing it. It's been very predictable and reliable. But if you look upstream, things are happening in the business environment where you might have had 10 suppliers before, and now you only have 3 suppliers. And so if you lose one of those, what happens? you might have to substitute another ingredient. As regulators, we would be asked, hey, can I make this substitution? And of course, we would evaluate that and be able to provide some information, perhaps a flexibility. But whenever supply chains consolidate and you have to change something, you may have to change to another supplier where you don't have as much information, as much certainty on the safety, on the risk profile, on the hazard analysis. And so I would say, the thing right now that we think a lot about are supply chain risks.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Greg.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not inclined to consider just a kind of black swan event. I think rather you consider emerging risk from the perspective of something could go wrong. What would the impact of that be, and how do you prepare to react to an unknown? For me, and we've identified loads, climate change, geopolitical events. What would worry me is the conflation of those risks, and because I think they'll happen over time, slowly at the same, and then you'll have one or two happening at the same time. And a little bit like Don said, it's going to impact supply chains, the availability of ingredients, and where, as a regulator, I would worry then is there will be pressure to relax some of the safety rules, and that's what would keep me up at night, amongst the other things. I remember during the COVID crisis, when I was working in health, and there was a shortage of healthcare professionals, and there were calls to relax the standards, and it took quite a bit to maintain. This is the set level we've decided is appropriate, and that stays regardless.
And in a crisis, sorry.
Yeah, you have to say it remains regardless. So there is need for flexibility, but you have to have a base level, I think, to consider this against. The other thing that worries me a little bit is the growth of influencers, who in some cases can be considered bad actors. And I think they might, in some instances, impede the ability of the system to react. So there's a problem, there's a solution that's sensible, but the influencer will say, actually, that's not good. And that might impede our ability to react.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we see that a lot, I think, with influencers, supporting and condoning, different food safety, food supplements, et cetera, which have been found out to either not work or to be problematic. And it's very difficult, as Julian was saying earlier, once that information is out, to actually kind of combat it and fight misinformation. I think that's a really good point, actually. So Catherine, where do you stand on this in terms of these kind of predicting the future?
Yeah, well, I cannot only agree with all that has been said, but I think also now that we are committed to the food systems transformation, in decreasing the carbon footprint of the food systems that we know is quite high, and in trying to be more sustainable, then we might need to make some trade-offs, decisions that might have a possible future impact on food safety. And I think we should also not forget, and it has already been mentioned, the circular economy, that we need to be very vigilant on when implementing the circular economy, that there could be areas and steps that might have an impact on food safety. The fate of micro nanoplastics and the possible inactivation of pathogens, or the lower inactivation rate of pathogens if linked to some of these particles. So to me, these are the most important things. And then I think the work that FAO has done in identifying drivers is very important, because when we had in Europe the Ebola crisis, remember some years ago, we did also some work at EFSA, and then we saw, for example, that deforestation in Africa and in South America could also then bring new virus. And then we saw later on the COVID pandemic. And I think with the COVID, we are very lucky that it was a respiratory virus and not a gastrointestinal virus. So food was safe. And so at the beginning, we didn't know, but at the end, it was not impacted in that way. Okay, it impacted the supply chain, but not really the food as a possible vehicle for getting COVID. So And then I would also mention that we look to the future, but we still have very important threats ongoing here. And one is antimicrobial resistance. We see the number of people affected by antimicrobial resistance and the number of deaths globally is not decreasing enough. And that's something we have in our hands since years, and we are really trying globally and also Codex and internationally to decrease that, but we are not really successful yet. So we still need to look forward, but also to keep in mind what we already have, and also as also Don mentioned, the number of preventable diseases and preventable death that we have. And listeria is one of those, and I think also from the food industry, that's a very important one. And we see not only in outbreaks, but also see in sporadic cases, for example, of elderly men living alone and maybe not keeping the right conditions on fridges and the hygienic conditions. So I think, yes, we need to look for the future, but we still have a lot of work to do today with the current risks that we are facing.
Thanks so much, Marta. So as we've been here, we've got 4 different but very complementary perspectives here, and it's been so important. And things that I've remembered is the fact that that a multidisciplinary approach is essential, but breaking down the silos, as you said, which is the beauty of a conversation like this in many respects. But to remember the risks that are inherent in the supply chain, and be able to kind of react to those, and not only react, be proactive. And then as Greg was saying, prepare for the perfect storm, I think, a perfect storm of risks that we could be facing, and have the tools in place, and be aware of those new influences, as you were saying, the bad actors, and be able to react to those very fast, and maybe identify them in advance, and be on social media and see what's going on. And while we look to the future, also keep your feet very firmly in the present. But thank you so much for this insight and very reflective panel that's been just absolutely wonderful to be a part of. Thank you very much.